Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Farmland Ponds. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Sam Hanks, and I am the Farmland Wildlife Advisor, Suffolk Wildlife Trust. Before we begin, I would just like to remind you of some simple webinar housekeeping points. Your camera and microphone will remain off throughout this evening's webinar. Please use the question and answer facility at the bottom of your screen to raise a question for our panelists, which we will endeavour to answer at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and we will share a link to the recording when it is available. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the generous support of Catchment Sensitive Farming Initiative in helping us to put this webinar together, as well as the freely given time and enthusiasm of our panelists in the run-up to this evening. Thank you all. Why are we talking about farmland ponds? Farmland ponds are certainly one of the most diverse features of the farmed landscape, often with much historical and cultural importance in addition to their wildlife value. Norfolk and Suffolk between them have something in the region of 50,000 farmland ponds, and depending on who you ask, between 70 and 90% of these are in a rather poor state. These potential wildlife havens have been a focus for much conservation action over recent decades in both counties, but there is a lot still to do. Suffolk Wildlife Trust have been involved in pond projects for many years now, and the success of the Norfolk Ponds Project has inspired the forming of the Suffolk Ponds Group that we are hosting this evening. These multidisciplinary groups, formed of farmers, academics, conservationists, and individual experts, among others, aim to collaborate to secure a step change in the amount of restoration and management of ponds in their respective counties. The two main issues facing ponds in the wider countryside are mass terrestrialization, the process by which ponds dry out over time through the accumulation of organic matter and silt, and overshading of ponds, reducing the abundance and diversity of life in the pond. Both issues have arisen over the last 100 years or so as ponds have fallen out of regular management in the cycle of agriculture. The end point of this is the ghost pond, arising either through the loss of unmanaged ponds or by deliberate backfilling to win land. We will hear more on these and their potential for resurrection from Carl shortly. Fortunately, there is much action that we all, farmers, conservationists, and members of the public alike, can take to improve the fortune of ponds like these in the farmed landscape. Key to getting this done is good understanding of what a pond can be, knowledge of how this works for wildlife, understanding why it's important for you and your farm, and a clear idea of where to get help if you need it. We hope that this evening's webinar will be informative and inspire you to action for ponds and their wildlife. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce you to this evening's speakers. Juliet Hawkins is going to kick off. Drawing on her 30 years experience advising on ponds, she will treat us to a 10-minute tour de force of what a good pond can look like. Carl Sayer of both University College London and the Norfolk Ponds Project will then highlight recent research into the wildlife benefits that can be achieved through pond restorations, as well as giving us a whirlwind tour of the world of ghost ponds. Richard Symes, a farmer of the Brownfield Pondscape area, will then tell you why ponds still matter on farms and where all this talk fits in the real world. Helen Greaves will then finish with a short summary and talk on why collaborative enterprise is a good idea in conservation and why we should all be cooperating to get more done. Without further hesitation then, I should like to hand over to Juliet to start us off. Juliet, if you could turn your video on and unmute yourself.
It says I can't. I've started my video, but it says I can't until you've stopped it. Right. Okay. Hello, everyone. Good evening, all. This is the first time I've done one of these, and good evening, all. I've got 10 minutes to answer the question, what does a good farm pond look like? So I'm going to start with the next slide, please, Sam, which is, Sam, can you put the next, thank you. So this is my first example of a good pond. It was created in 2009, funded by the Millennium Pond Project, and one of 10 ponds created on what was then Suffolk Wildlife Trust's Grove Farm Nature Reserve. It's now morphed into the Blackbourne Valley Nature Reserve. It was created in a field corner, and almost as many ancient farm ponds were restored at the same time as new ones were created. You'll see that a chunk of field corner was removed from arable and allowed to regenerate into rough tussocky grass and scrub, and that was a really important buffer against ongoing arable operations. It's shallow, no more than 1.5 meters deep. It's got shallow gradient margins, and because it depends on rain and groundwater for its water source, its water levels fluctuate annually. It's open and sunny. 4 years later on the left, it looks a little bare and it's still in early stages of succession, but it had 20 or so species of water fleas, caddisflies, mayflies, dragonflies, water boatmen, pond skaters, diving beetles, crawling beetles, and about 25% of the pond was colonized by 4 or so species of plants. So it's looking good after 4 years. By 2019, on the right, we've also got frogs, smooth newts, great crested newts, and grass snake, and 12 or so plant species. So it's developed well. It's surrounded by all that mosaic of scrub and grass, which is excellent, hedges and trees, and crucially, it is linked to other ponds, old and new. It's what I would call a good wildlife pond, and it's pretty in the landscape, which is a nice bonus. Next slide, please. So the ancient pond, the good example of an ancient pond, number 2, is in Walpole. It's restored. It was created possibly as long ago as the 1500s, probably to remove clay for local clay lump building or later to make bricks. And subsequently, like most of our Suffolk ponds, it's actually had a man-managed history. So firstly, in that area, it was probably used as a retting pond, possibly used as a retting pond for the local hemp industry around Halesworth. And at some stage, it was almost certainly used for watering livestock. Its margins will have been regularly coppiced to keep it open, and it will have been cleaned out, and the accumulating leaf litter and organic matter would have been put to good use on the fields adjacent to mull them. And then in more recent times, it became neglected, and it had arable cultivations right up to the margin. So it's one of 24 ancient ponds on this 350-acre farm, and it's one of 22,000 or so ponds in Suffolk. Norfolk are going to tell you they've got 23,000, by the way. Funded by stewardship, along with 18, 20 or so other ponds on the farm, it was restored in a sort of phased approach from a neglected, shaded state to its original shape and profile and depth. So it actually looks quite steep-sided on several of its sides, but actually that's what clay pits look like. But it's gentle where the livestock have trampled it down or where horse-drawn carts access the bottom of the pond to take the clay first and the organic matter later. It's set quite deep in the landscape, but the water is actually quite shallow and the water levels fluctuate annually. So it was a seasonally wet, dark hole, but within a year, just a year of it being restored, it had a wonderful aquatic community of similar creatures as the new pond we've just talked about, including the great crested newts. But, crucially, it also had 18 plants within a year whose seeds had lain dormant in the organic matter for years, including, excitedly, the slimy fruited stonewort, which was thought to have been extinct in England, and the tassel stonewort, a rare and endangered species. So it's now buffered from the arable operations by a 6-metre margin. It's linked to the other ponds by hedges and margins. It's a good pond, and its sensitive restoration has restored, to my mind, incredibly importantly, an ancient countryside feature, along with the wildlife community it supports. So, next slide, please. So is the new pond created and protected on a nature reserve better than an ancient restored farm pond? So I'm going to say it's different, and it's valuable for different features, and they'll both be vulnerable to different threats. The nature reserve pond has already got a small fragment of New Zealand pygmyweed, which is an alien plant, very invasive, and it'll threaten the plants in the pond, and if it gets into the other ponds on the nature reserve, could cause a nightmare to manage. There's no magic solution to get rid of it. The farm pond is vulnerable to agricultural pollution. Pesticide drift, fertiliser drift into the feed ditch or directly into the pond, or a change in government policy that no longer supports payments to buffer ponds. But the ancient pond has had a 500-year head start on being a good pond. It's had different insects brought in on the wind that have probably survived in the squidge, and it's had a variety of plant seeds brought in on a cow's hoof or a duck's foot. So when it was restored, there was a good chance that long-lived ooze spores of stonewort and seeds of other plants that were lying dormant in the pond squidge could immediately start growing once they were given light and removal of smothering leaf litter. And then, of course, there's other wildlife that might be thriving locally or hanging on at the margins and able to recolonise quickly. So pond creation is great, but where there are no ponds, I believe restoring some of our Suffolk farmland ponds should be a priority, because the benefits are so much quicker and potentially restore lost species to our landscape. Last slide. So what does a good farm pond full of wildlife look like? Firstly, all these farm ponds that are good will have their own unique wildlife community, but they'd have certain things in common. They'd have good water quality from a clean water source. They'd have plenty of sunlight reaching the pond margins, and ideally most of the pond. They would have varied gradients with plenty of shallow water. They'd have a good wildlife habitat mosaic around the pond, and that's something that often gets forgotten. But most wildlife that actually uses ponds needs other habitat for part of its life. And ideally, it will be set in a wider and interconnected pondscape of different ponds in different stages of succession. We don't want every good pond to be the same. So that was a quick tour through good ponds. There are so many ponds out there waiting for just a little bit of restoration work to make them absolutely amazing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Juliet. That was excellent. We will now hand over to Carl to speak on the work of UCL and Norfolk Ponds Project.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm going to agree with everything that Juliet just said there, and there's no competition at all between Norfolk and Suffolk, despite the 1,000 ponds extra. So restoring farmland ponds, evidence of success from science. We've been working on ponds for the last 10 years or so, and really just to try and demonstrate the benefits of pond restoration for all sorts of things, as we'll show you. So you'll see these huge number of benefits of restoring ponds and valuing ponds in farmland. And so many people are involved in this work, and especially coming out of work at UCL and the Norfolk Ponds Project. So the inspiration for my talk is Richard Waddingham. He has a farm in northeast Norfolk, and there are 40 ponds on the farm, and it's just the most magnificent pond mosaic. And Richard has been looking after his ponds for the last 40 or so years. And in contrast to many places, you know, where the ponds are all overgrown, as Sam said, and you've got all these ponds that are overgrown by trees, at Manor Farm, you've got a mosaic of ponds, all at different stages of succession, as Juliet said. Some with trees, some with low scrub, some with reedy, swampy margins. And as you see in the bottom right-hand corner, still some very overgrown ponds present as well. And the difference, really, between Richard's ponds and ponds in the surrounding landscape is that Richard manages his ponds in a traditional way, And of his 40 ponds, he takes 3 or 4 per year, and then removes the scrub and goes in with a digger and does a bit of a scrape out sometimes. And you end up with ponds that are just freshly managed, and then ponds that are a bit further on from management. And you might ask that question, is it a good idea to do this? Well, just look at this. This is a comparison of Richard's ponds on the right and surrounding Overgrown ponds on the left in the wider landscape from Helen Greaves's work, who you'll listen to later. And you can see it's a phenomenally higher diversity of aquatic invertebrates in Richard's ponds. It's astonishingly higher. So doing this work on ponds is a huge benefit for ponds. So we thought, well, we've got to try and replicate this, and let's see what we can do elsewhere. We started on my dad's little field pond in Bodham in North Norfolk. I'm sure there's many people from Bodham here. Hello, all of you. And here is the pond before restoration. So covered in trees. It had been overgrown for many, many decades. So we started to clear the trees out on the south side in particular. Then we went in with a digger and removed a lot of the mud, a really large proportion of that got spread on the fields. And then we left it be. We did nothing else to that pond. And by September in the next year, so just 1 year on, you would have no idea that we'd been to this pond and done any of that activity. The colonisation is dramatically fast. It's full of aquatic plants. And then by the second year after restoration, we'd recorded 17 species of dragonfly. All the sort of main British amphibians were breeding, including great crested newt, and a whole host of different aquatic plants. So we're absolutely thrilled with this result. And what that did really, after seeing Richard's ponds and after seeing that we could do this on a few ponds, we started the Norfolk Ponds Project to try and sort of deliver this thing on a much bigger scale. There's so many ponds to restore, and we want to sort of advocate pond restoration, then also deliver pond restoration, and then through UCL see the benefits. So we've done about 180 restorations so far. I'm just going to show you some now, so you can go ooh and ah on these. Here's a pond before restoration and during, and now you're going to see exactly the same spot after restoration 2 years on. So it's an astonishingly beautiful, species-rich, complex pond. Here's another one through the ages, and you can see the colonisation there in the bottom 2 pictures. You can see it's a little bit bare in the first year, but then this really almost mature looking planty, crystal clear watered pond by year 2. And here's Helen Greaves in a pond, and then you've got the same pond 2 years on. And if you get these before and afters exactly bang on, you can just see the dramatic change. So this is something that you can do quickly, and it has a huge benefit. But we want to see what this would actually do at the landscape scale if we restore lots of ponds. How does this benefit the whole landscape? So at Hayden in North Norfolk, we restored 12 ponds over 2015 to 2018, and we had 4 overgrown ponds that we left as controls that we didn't restore. And here are the results for aquatic plants. So restored ponds are on the left-hand side. This is the number of wetland plants, and you can see that you've got this very, very big increase in plant species richness over time through the years, and that's just kept on climbing to the present day. And our control ponds have more or less managed to sort of stay the same. So very, very big benefits of wetland plants. We saw many more ponds that had different amphibian species in the pond landscape. And I won't show the invertebrate data, but it was equally dramatic. And almost everything we look at in these pond landscapes, we see big benefits. And the other thing, as Juliet sort of hinted at, it's not just common species, it's exceptionally rare species. We saw species like the holly-leaved naiad, Naias marina, and the grass Polylythrum hysopifolia, and that was the first record for Norfolk for 100 years. So these are, amazing ponds producing amazing species that you might think are just, nature reserve things, but they're in the middle of a farmer's field. What other benefits for ponds? Well, we noticed when we're surveying ponds that you often get a lot of birds at ponds, and in fact Richard Waddingham restored his ponds because he loved birds and he noticed that they used them. And you can see in this picture, there's lots of swifts sort of going by. So we did a comparison of 8 restored ponds and 8 overgrown ponds for farmland birds, just all the birds that you might see in farmland. And our restored ponds, we saw double the number of bird species. So all sorts of things, different finches, yellowhammers, linnets, you know, whitethroats, all visiting these ponds and spending lots of time at these ponds, whereas they weren't at the overgrown ponds. And here's the sort of bird activity at these ponds. There were many more visits, well over double the number of visits of birds to the restored ponds. Why is that? Well, in this pond, you can see you've got a little insect trap. It's collecting emerging insects. And that was a theory, really, that you got more insects coming out of these ponds feeding the birds. And if you look at this plot here, you can see huge numbers of emerging insects on the left-hand side in the restored ponds, and then very much lower numbers of emerging insects in the overgrown ponds. And look at this underwater shot. If you just see the number of insects in here, and you've got lots and lots of mayflies. And of course, they're all emerging from the pond. A journey underwater there, and then of course what you've got all those insects and all the sort of emerging into the atmosphere, if you hit the right moment, you see all of these birds coming to feed. So ponds feed the birds. It's a hugely important role of ponds. Do they also benefit other things like pollinators? The answer is yes. Because the edges of these restored ponds are more open, you get more wildflowers. As you can see in this plot, you get, you know, almost treble the abundance of daytime pollinators at restored ponds. So all sorts of benefits there. And then finally, really, a little bit of a tour of ghost ponds. I'll just turn the light off for this. Very important we get the right atmosphere. Ponds that have been filled in over time. Here is a pond that was filled in about 50 years ago, just a slight depression in the field. Here is us digging it out, and you can see the black sediment of the former pond underneath the field. Here is us finished, and you might think this is going to take years to be a nice pond. I'm going to shock you now. There it is filling up with water, and there it is just 1 year on. Not the most attractive pond, but still full of different aquatic plants. Amazing. And then just a few years on, look at this. The ghostiness has turned into a vibrant, non-zombie-like, incredibly species-rich pond. So you can get this incredible effect. I don't want to scare you. And why do we get these rapid effects in ponds that are ghost ponds or restored ponds? Is because we've got this incredible seed bank, which is still viable, and we've shown this from greenhouse experiments. Even after 150 years of burial under a field, the seeds of all these water plants are still alive, and that's why you can get this rapid colonization of all these really rare plants. So huge benefits of restoring ponds for aquatic and terrestrial wildlife in farmland. And have a look at the work of the Norfolk Ponds Project and our UCL Ponds Restoration Group, and you can find out a lot more. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. That was absolutely fascinating, and some wonderful series of photographs there, showing just what can be achieved in such a short period of time with pond restorations. Really great to see. We're going to pass over now to Richard Symes of Bramfield. If you want to start sharing your screen, Richard, we should be good to go. And Richard's going to talk to us on the farmer's point of view and why he likes to look after his ponds where he is.
Oh, good evening. Sam, can you see the picture?
We can see it, Richard, and we can hear you perfectly well.
Wonderful, jolly good. Well, good evening, everybody. Well, when I started farming, the attitude was, well, why bother with ponds? They're just something that's in the way, maybe somewhere convenient to tip all the rubbish. After all, they were never dug for wildlife. Most of them were dug by man, not all of them. We've got a few natural ponds. But that was the attitude in the past. But things have changed. And I farm here at Earlsway, and this is a diversified farm business with commercial arable farming using the bulk of the 400 acres. I've always tried to balance the arable farming with care for the countryside, the woodland, the meadows, hedgerows, and of course the ponds. This has always seemed to be a sensible, responsible thing to do. And the farm is also my home, and I prefer to live in a pleasant bit of English countryside rather than an American-style prairie. I did work on one of those once. In industry jargon, I practice integrated farm management as promoted by LEAF, or at least I try to. For the last 20 years, a sizable stewardship scheme has been a significant part of the farm business diversification. But sadly, Natural England has never funded ponds particularly well in these schemes, or not to my mind. A pity, because they are so important, especially here. My parish of Branfield has one of the highest densities of ponds in the country. And I've got 17 on this farm. Not quite as many as the farm Carl was alluding to that's got 40, but maybe that's a bigger farm. But several years ago, I joined up with a neighbour, and the two farms managed to get some special funding for our ponds under the Millennium Pond Project. Instead of getting a few £100 a year, I got a £20,000 grant, and so did my neighbour. Now that made a difference. And the difference really became apparent a couple of years ago when another adjacent farm, adjacent to the two of us, changed hands, and the three farms joined up with Suffolk Wildlife Trust, and very much with Juliet's help, undertook a whole lot of survey work. The ponds on this third farm had been neglected for at least 50 years. They were totally silted up and overgrown, probably like this one. The survey counted 22 species of dragonflies and butterflies on the two farms with restored ponds. The farm with the neglected ponds had just 3. That was scary. Despite that farm having plenty of hedgerows, woodland, and grass meadows. Life needs water, and in a dry summer, the only water here is in the ponds. And our ponds never dry out, and so much life just depends on it. The insects, birds, mammals, apart from the aquatic life actually in the pond. You can have all the trees and meadows and hedgerows you like, but without water, the wildlife will either move, if it can, or it will die, or just go very dormant. The bird survey we had across the 3 farms confirmed this as well. And there were more birds on the 2 farms with good ponds. And that was, the surveys were done in the height of summer when it was dry. The restored ponds have an amazing variety of life in the water as well. We knew we had great crested newts all over the place around here, but Juliet's survey work discovered all sorts of other rarities of national and international importance, one extreme rarity, a stonewort that was listed as extinct in the UK. And that really did make her day when she discovered that one. The neglected ponds had nothing in them at all, of course. But the wonderful thing about pond restoration, as you've heard earlier, is the speed they come back to life when you restore them. Our neighbour, who had just taken on this farm with all these neglected ponds, took one look at the survey results and he went out and booked a digger. And the following summer, not only had all the 3 farms got great crested newts, but water beetles, the rare stoneworts, and all sorts of other stuff as well. And these ponds were full of life in less than a year. Ponds are not difficult to restore, not really. You remove the shading, get rid of some trees, and you dig out the sludge. Leave a little bit behind because there's probably some seeds and spores of different things that will grow, and there's no need to be too tidy. It's amazing what one can do in a day or two with a digger. And for a large pond, as you can see here, a pair of diggers can work well, one feeding the other one. It's quicker than trying to do it with one. Once this is done, you don't need to do it again for a long time, just a bit of maintenance. The bank can be trimmed occasionally with a hedge cutter. A bit of patch scooping is quick if a digger's around. And I had a digger patch scoop 4 ponds in an hour and a half. And you can see the result there, just a little bit on the side. That's all we did, just a little bit on one side. And we'll do a little bit on the other side another year. It's good to have a buffer strip next to a pond, and I have at least 6 meters of grass margin between a pond and the arable land. Everything is connected by grass margins and hedgerows, and the distance between those trees is actually the width of the buffer next to this pond. The success of having 3 farms working with Suffolk Wildlife Trust led to a group of 6 farms. We're now planning to create a full-size farm cluster on an even larger scale. We want to follow the water course all the way down to Blytheborough, and the aim is to get at least 2,000 hectares involved, which will be more than 3 times what we have now, and the cluster area would be about nearly 10 miles long. And Sam is giving us a lot of help at the moment trying to make this actually happen. It will all be in a single water catchment area. It will follow the stream, and it will include Suffolk Wildlife Trust's own reserve at Thorrington. There will be a lot of ponds in this cluster. Our 6 farms have nearly 100 ponds, so the full-size cluster will have a great deal more. Where am I? I've lost my notes. Some of the rare things that Juliet has found here on the 3 farms will hopefully have a much more secure future. And we want to do this for the wildlife and the landscape, but we are also preparing for the future. The future looks as if it will be about public money for public goods. I'm sure you've heard that. Assuming there's any public money left after COVID, of course. But some of those public goods can only be delivered at scale. And if you can read this slide, you will see things like clean air, clean and plentiful water, and beauty, heritage, engagement with the environment. Things like that are difficult to do on a small farm, but you need a huge landscape. The new environmental land management scheme will be tiered. And from what we know so far, there will be more opportunities and more funding for the larger landscape scale projects that are collaborative across farms. And you can see DEFRA's aims, and we are getting prepared to try and help deliver them at scale. So we will see how we get on. Without ponds that hold water, this farm would be a very poor place, a much poorer place for all wildlife, not just the pond wildlife. And I just want to finish with a huge thank you to Suffolk Wildlife Trust for all their help and inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It's an absolute pleasure to work with you. Your enthusiasm is quite infectious. You can talk for hours on ponds and wildlife and farming. It's brilliant. We're going to hand over now to Helen for a short piece on why collaboration is a good idea and getting results through working together. Helen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sam, and thank you to all the other speakers this evening. And really that question, why should farmers, academics and conservation organisations be talking more, is for those exact reasons that we've seen this evening and the purpose of us putting on this event. Each group has a wonderful knowledge and experience themselves, and by using this collaborative approach and communication, we can share that knowledge and experience. And that's really what I wanted to just briefly talk about, which is this strategy that Carl and I explored back in 2013 when we had our initial scientific findings from the UCL Pond Restoration Research Group. And at that time we knew that farmland pond landscapes were vital to the UK aquatic and terrestrial conservation. And we were wondering how to really implement this on the ground. We knew that we wanted to increase the number of marlpit ponds across Norfolk, and we knew that we really needed to encourage farmers and landowners to restore these types of ponds. So by looking and speaking to those farmers, we were able to demonstrate that there are little financial incentives available. And that really made us think about those solutions. And there was two different types of solution we could go for. One being this top-down approach, using policy to influence landowners and farmers, using ELMS and the EU biodiversity strategy. And we talked a little bit about ELMS this evening. But there was also this idea of a bottom-up approach. Could we, by collectively getting together a steering group of local partnership organisations, could we develop practical guidance, and could we encourage links between farmers, science and conservationists in order to harness goodwill? And we tried to try out both of those approaches, and I just wanted to explain what happened so we can learn and move forward and think about the success of the Norfolk Ponds Project for the benefit of the Suffolk Ponds Project as well. So we initially tried to lobby policymakers for the inclusion of ponds in pond restoration in policies, but really we were just a small academic voice, and there were little grant funding opportunities to put on a project for us as UCL. And therefore we decided to go down this approach of forming the Norfolk Ponds Project. In doing so, by creating this partnership, we created a voice for lots of NGOs all working together. We were then able to put on workshops and undertake more restorations, and those farmers and landowners were included in that those workshops, and that created a landowner voice as well. And then by demonstrating all those good works of the farmers through media and social media over time, we've also created a public voice for this as well. So all those three groups all together plus the academic voice that was there original, creates this much stronger argument for this. And by working together, one of the things that we've been able to influence is to get pond restorations into district level licensing, and that's something we've really worked hard to do and is becoming a really great success. So why does this model work? Well, the academics are able to bring along the science that we've got time to do and the expertise in as well. The farmers have got the ponds and the land, and the conservation organisations have on the ground practitioners with lots of knowledge and experience. So together we can put on different things like producing guidance and producing workshops, and with farmers producing workshops for each other, and by providing access for public engagement as well. And altogether that leads to evidence-based pond restorations. And we can really see the benefit of this over the years in Norfolk. So this is taken from a paper that came out last year by Carl and myself. And we can see the impact of all the work done in Norfolk with the uptake of pond management in countryside stewardship schemes being much higher in Norfolk than other similar counties with high pond densities. So even so though, agri-environment schemes, as you can see, still have very low uptake on for pond restorations and pond management. So there's still lots of work to be done, but we can see the benefit. Overall though, as we've demonstrated this evening, restoring ponds really do enhance biodiversity on farmland and may well result in the highest net gain in farmland. And it would be great to have more in policy and have more top-down influence as well as bottom-up influence, but we have achieved so much already with the goodwill of farmers, landowners, conservationists and academics working together, and we can do so much more. So let's keep going.
Thank you very much, Helen. Excellent presentation and very good points. Thank you to all of our speakers this evening. I believe we are pretty much on time, a little bit ahead in fact, which is brilliant. Didn't expect that. We now have about 15 minutes for any questions that have been asked in the Q&A box. I'm just having a look through now. Helen, if you could stop screen sharing, and if I could ask everyone to turn their cameras on, please. We've had quite a few questions come through, and quite a few have been answered already, which is helpful. If you want to have a look at the answered questions, you may be able to see them. I'm not sure what the attendees can see. Should we kick off with a question from Mark on: is ancient natural pond that is at least 500 years old and was used by the ancient Tudor coaching inn, shaded, it's nearly dried out, has very few aquatic plants growing in it, and would like some advice on the best steps and guidance and support that he can get. Carl, you've indicated that you'd like to answer this question live. Would you like to jump in there? So, sorry, Carl, you're on mute at the moment.
I was going to pass that on to Juliet, actually.
Yeah. Can you see the question, Juliet?
I can't, but I can remember it. I guess I would go through some fairly standard steps in making sure everything's being done responsibly. So I'd have a good survey, good look at it beforehand to check what wildlife's already there that might be very happy there, that might be priorities. You don't want to go restoring something if it's already good. And I think you mentioned there are great crested newts there and so on already. Now, quite a lot of people say, oh, my pond's brilliant, it's got great crested newts. The reality is that newts you could have one newt laying 200 eggs, and it's not a particularly healthy pond otherwise. It's just hanging on there. So just because you've got one great crested newt doesn't mean to say you couldn't have 500 great crested newts. You need to first of all assess what you've got, and I merely use newts as an indicator species because one's looking at so much more. Assuming that it could do with some restoration, usually the first things are to let the light in, which involves coppicing the trees or shrubs around much of the pond, to ensure that some or all of the margins get plenty of sunlight. And then once you've coppiced, you've made it more accessible to machinery, you then get a digger in. And what's important is that you said it's an old pond. It's very important that you don't just read all the things that say all ponds must have gently shelving margins and whatever. Look at what you've got, and when it was last restored or managed, and if it really its original shape and size, look at old maps and things, it hasn't changed, then don't go changing it hugely. You're going to be taking most of the organic matter out. As Richard said, you're going to leave some in there. You want to leave a small amount that will be the source of dormant seeds and so on. Take it out, back to the original substrate. Don't be tempted to go deeper or steeper, and that would be my starting point.
Thank
I
you,
hope that helps.
That sounds very useful. I hope it helps Mark in his question as well. We have had one or two questions now on planning permission as well, and this is something that I do battle with occasionally for pond creations. It really depends on where you are and what your local planning authority requires. Certainly in Suffolk, any excavation activity is deemed as needing planning permission, so creation of new ponds, more or less wherever they are, you will have to go down the planning route. There are a few workarounds for permitted development, but the tests for these in the planning system are quite stringent. So be careful is really the answer there. And chat to your local authority, because talking to them first save you a lot of headache later on. Joe, we're getting a lot of questions on funding. I know you've answered a few by typing. I wondered if it was worth just touching on funding so that everybody can hear.
Yeah, so there is funding available in Countryside Stewardship Scheme, mid-tier and higher tier. I think perhaps Richard touched on the fact that it's not quite as generous as it could be. So the mid-tier funding was set about 7 years ago. So for pond management stroke restoration, it's £270 per pond for up to the first 100 square metre. Over the 100 square metre, it's £170 per square metre. And the option that's available in higher tier will actually pay all of the costs. It's 100% of the actual costs, but there's conditions attached. It has to be on a triple SI with ecological designated water bodies of 1 hectare or more. So not quite perhaps as straightforward as we'd hope. And I think somebody else raised the question about elms, going forward into elms, and we'd very much hope that these options would be simplified and be able to use sort of more or less all over the country with better payments.
Yeah, I think that's an ambition of just about everyone here, isn't it? To lobby for elms payments to be better, to get things done.
Yeah.
I should add to that note on funding that there is a new scheme specifically related to newts and development, which many of you may have heard about, called district level licensing, which is from Natural England and is funded by payments from developers to restore and create ponds. And I know that's how I've done a lot of ponds this last year and a half. I know it's how Norfolk Ponds Project have done a lot of theirs. It's more generous and effectively would deliver ponds at no cost to the landowner. But you do have to sign up to a 25-year agreement to allow access to that pond. Any ongoing maintenance costs should also be covered with the scheme. So it's another way to go about it, and do get in touch with your local wildlife trust if there's a district level licensing scheme. I say local, your local delivery body, it doesn't have to be a wildlife trust. If there's a district level licensing scheme near you, is having ponds ready to go is really helpful. Helen, I believe you've flagged a question here.
I did, but I think Joe, it was from a
Joe's probably answered it.
and Joe's pretty much covered it. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So there's been a question asked a couple of times now on seeding ponds with old sludge, effectively, from good ponds. Is that something that anyone would like to comment on?
Yeah, I can comment on that, Sam.
Yeah.
As far as I know, that's never been tried before, but I think it'd be a great idea, and I know it would work. Wherever you put that magic mud that comes from an old pond, you know, from lower down in an old pond, wherever you put that, you know, you're going to get this growth of amazing aquatic plants from the seed bank, and it could be all sorts of stuff in it. So I would, if you've got a pond, I would either allow natural recolonisation. You know, that was always the best thing to do, but this might be worth just trialing this, you know, at some point. We've never researched it, but loads of people have mentioned it, and I've thought of it. But what you should never do is ever plant anything. You don't need to plant anything. Let nature bring your plants back. Never go to a garden centre or horticultural supplier to get plants. That can lead to problems of invasive plants as well. You know, just allow nature to bring your plants back as an overall point.
Yeah, I think we'd agree with that. Juliet, you've probably got a similar thoughts along those lines.
Yes, I'd agree with what Carl's saying. I mean, I haven't seen it done. What I do know from experiments with translocating stonework squidge is that it doesn't necessarily, you know, your rare plants are rare for a reason. They have very exacting requirements. So they won't automatically translocate. So I think it will, you know, it's likely to be successful for some species, and it would be really good. There's a research project, Carl, for one of your students. It would be really interesting to see.
Okay. Got a question here from Andrea. As how do you establish if a pond is overgrown or not? Perhaps, Carl, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, when we're making decisions in the Norfolk Ponds Project on which ponds we look to restore, we tend to choose ponds which are dominated, you know, that don't have big oak trees around them or really interesting big valuable trees. We tend to choose the ones which are entirely shrouded over by willow at a really, really high shading. And I think it's those ponds where you get the maximum benefit. You know, you get a big benefit. When you've got ponds which are sort of semi-shaded, you know, it's a question really of what you've got in the landscape. You know, have you got ponds like the one you want to manage? If not, leave it. But you know, if you've got a landscape full of ponds which are very, very overgrown, then I would say, you know, go for that really, and go get some of those really heavily overgrown ones restored. But it's a bit subjective. You know, it really depends, I think, what you've got in the landscape. Look at what you've got and make a decision on that basis.
Sam, can I just come in there and say, I mean, I would say that this is a perfect example of where ongoing patch scooping or patch scraping management is a really good tool, because it may be that you want to reset parts of an area. If you know you've got a rare plant, for example, that likes the early stages of succession, actually, if you've got a digger on the farm and it's not going to cost you much more to half an hour take a couple of scrapes or scoops out of the pond, and it's the middle of winter, you're not going to be doing any damage to plants, to creatures in their breeding stages, then actually taking a few scoops out of a really invasive area of reed mace or common reed or something, actually means that some of those plants that have been outcompeted completely will get a chance to thrive again, set seeds, be in the squidge, and that might be really important for creatures that depend on them. So I would say that where in the past we've done this sort of catastrophic go in and restore an entire pond, and it's huge, it's a huge operation, it's expensive. Once you've got good ponds, they're naturally going to develop stands of invasive vegetation or so on. But by just going in and taking out a couple of scrapes every now and then, like Richard was showing, is really useful in ensuring a bit of open water. I mean, some species like newts, for example, do need patches of open water to display in. They like that, and so too does stoneworts. Sorry to mention stoneworts again. But I do think it's an area that we really should be looking at. You know, in years gone past, you would have had livestock in these ponds. They would have been doing that, opening up of ponds on a regular basis. They'd go in, they browse where they can get to, and they would be constantly setting areas back to early stages of succession.
I just wanted to add one little thing, if I could quickly. Well, I picked up Carl's comment about restoring the most overgrown ponds, and the picture of the pond that I started my little talk with, that's actually inside a block of ancient woodland, and it was probably 5 or 10 years before I ever knew there was actually a pond there to restore. It was so overgrown. It's a very shallow pond. It's not a man-made steep-sided pond. It's very, very shallow. And it had so much willow in it that had grown and fallen into the pond and then rotted, and then it had grown by layering. And I thought it was just a dense clump of willow trees. You could walk across it even in winter if you could struggle through all the undergrowth. And then eventually one day, it was incredibly wet in the winter, and it was so gooey in the middle, I thought there might actually be a pond here. I just didn't know there was a pond. And I think, Juliet, it was years ago when you looked at it in the woodland and you said, get a digger in. And there we are. It works. But you've got to find the pond sometimes.
We should say all these conversations about ponds being overgrown, woodland ponds are really valuable as well, as those open ponds in the wider landscape. Helen, there's a question here on biodiversity net gain scores and favouring restorations as opposed to creations.
Yes, I wanted to touch briefly on that because, you know, this is something that I feel really, you know, passionately about, in the sense that when I started my PhD, it was because I wanted to do something that could be achieved alongside really highly productive farmland. So what's really interesting about pond restoration is the fact that, you know, we're not taking any more productive farmland in order to achieve these goals. And pond creation is, you know, I wouldn't say that it should be favoured, restoration should be favoured over creation in any way. Creation is definitely something we want. More ponds created in farmland or wherever possible, and more water in the landscape in general. But what's exciting about the pond restoration is that this is a resource that's there and it's being underused. It's got so much potential, and we just need to do a little bit of work and it flourishes, and the wildlife comes back. So that's what's really exciting about it.
I think that it's the speed, isn't it, with the restoration stuff, that's really
absolutely. Yeah, so both very important, and it's what's practical. It's what's practical. And
yes. And don't forget, any creation work, certainly in Suffolk, is a planning permission route as well, which makes it a bit harder. Okay, we are now up against our time. I have a couple of questions for the audience via some Zoom polls. So Claire, if you would be able to launch, please, the first poll. We would like to just get an idea of what you'd like to see. If you'd like to see more webinars like this, if you would like webinars on particular pond issues, if you would like webinars on pond research, if you like different webinars on farmland habitats or species specific information. Possibly end the polling there because I think that's settling down now. Yeah, it looks like habitat webinars are quite popular, as are species webinars and pond surgery. We will see what we can do, bringing you those things. We've got one more poll for you if you want to hang around for that. Claire, if you could launch a second poll, that'd be really good. Are you going to go away from this webinar and do something? That's what I want to know. Are you going to go away and learn something? Are you going to go away and volunteer to do something? Are you going to restore a pond, create a pond? Are you going to seek advice from your local conservation organisations or pond group? I think we'll end the polling there. Thank you, Claire. Clearly, very inspirational talks, everyone. Everyone from this is going to go away and learn more. Fantastic. That's what we wanted to see. Lots of people voting to restore ponds, which is brilliant. Absolutely excellent stuff. Someone has already got some fantastic ponds, I see, which is nice. Just like to thank once again all of our speakers tonight. And thank you, Claire, behind the scenes, for helping us put this together and put it on. Couldn't have done it without you. Thank you, everyone, and we shall call it a night there.